Well, good evening. We are going to go by iPhone time tonight and not Cranbrook time, which, as some of you know, might be a delay of 10 minutes or so. So happy Valentine's Day and welcome to the sixth, hard to believe, installment of the History of American Architecture lecture series. My name is Greg Whitcup, and I have the pleasure of serving as the director of Cranbrook Center for Collections and Research, the sponsor of this program. If I may, I would also like to acknowledge the learning community in nearby East Lansing that, along with all of us, is trying to come to terms with another tragedy, this time on the MSU campus. Our hearts go out to the family and friends of the victims. Before I thank our sponsors and introduce our speaker tonight, I want to thank each and every one of you, whether you are in the auditorium or online, for joining us today. Through your registration fee, you are helping to support the work Cranbrook Center for Collections and Research does to preserve and share the history of Cranbrook, including our remarkable architectural legacy. For the sixth year in a row, I can honestly say you are part of a record audience of nearly 500 people this year, of which a very high percentage of us are joining online. Even as we schedule our signature campus tours, dinners, workshops, and in-person lectures like this, let me assure you that the center will continue to offer online programming, including this, our most popular series. Before I introduce our guide to the work of Frank Lloyd Wright and how it intersects the history of Cranbrook, I would like to thank our sponsors, the Smith Group, including the firm's cultural studio leader, Rodrigo Manriquez. Although they are a global architectural firm with offices around the world, Smith Group's roots are here in Detroit, where an architect by the name of Sheldon Smith opened an office in 1855. I had the pleasure of working with the firm when they restored the Sarn and Designed Art Museum and worked with us to create the new Collections Wing, a project that opened 11 years ago. That is also hard to believe. I would like to thank all of our friends at the Smith Group for continuing to support the work of the center. I'd also like to thank our friends here at Cranbrook Academy of Art and Art Museum for hosting us tonight in DeSalle Auditorium. It is always a pleasure to be back in this space. As the lecture series unfolds over the course of the next 4 weeks, I plan to share with you a few highlights of the center's upcoming programs and events. But today, I think I should simply introduce our speaker, the curator and architectural historian that will be guiding us through the world of Frank Lloyd Wright. Kevin Atkinson joined the center in 2016 as our collections fellow and quickly rose to the rank of curator. While I think of Kevin as a Renaissance man, a curator whose intellectual curiosity is seemingly boundless, his passion is for architecture and the built environment. A native of North Georgia, Kevin holds a BA in architecture from Yale and an MA in American material culture from the University of Delaware's prestigious Winterthur program, where his thesis examined postmodern shopping malls. Before coming to Cranbrook, Kevin worked for Robert A.M. Stern Architects in New York as a research and writing associate, and at Kent Bloomer Studio in New Haven, where he designed and fabricated architectural ornament. Over the course of the series' 5 lectures, you will come to find him to be a knowledgeable and engaging guide to American architecture and the work of Frank Lloyd Wright. In short, we are all in for a treat. Take it away, Kevin.
Thank you, Greg, and thank you everyone in the audience and everyone online for being with us tonight. This is the 6th History of Architecture series, and it is the first that we are doing double on Zoom and in the audience. So if things are a little weird on either end, I beg your patience. I want to thank everyone for coming out and for supporting the center in, I think, the most fun winter lecture series that is offered in Metro Detroit. Now, before I get started, I do want to just share a few words about why we might be studying Frank Lloyd Wright here at Cranbrook. Well, first of all, he's a genius and America's most famous architect, so merit enough to think about Frank Lloyd Wright. But he was also closely associated with Cranbrook, particularly in his influence on designs by Eliel Saarinen at Kingswood School for Girls, and as a visiting lecturer and critic and foe of the Cranbrook Academy of Art with his own rival Taliesin Academy. We'll learn a lot more about Cranbrook and Frank Lloyd Wright in later lectures. Tonight, we'll focus on who was he, his biography. Wright is the architect who first interested me in buildings. In elementary school, I got a trusty guide of Frank Lloyd Wright's work from Barnes & Noble, which is not only filled with the annotations of an elementary school me, but with lots of ephemera and programs and tickets from all of the travels that my dad and I did to go and see Frank Lloyd Wright's buildings. He took me on my first trip to see Frank Lloyd Wright's architecture in the 5th grade, stopping across Illinois en route to Chicago. Since then, I've been in a lot of Frank Lloyd Wright buildings, many multiple times, and I've expanded my architectural interest much more broadly. However, the work of Frank Lloyd Wright, his contemporaries, his apprentices, his rivals, and those he influenced and those he was influenced by continue to fascinate me. He really is a pillar in the history of architecture. As the first curator of the Frank Lloyd Wright Design Smith Group, which Cranbrook acquired in 2017, a central focus of my professional life has also now been dedicated to Frank Lloyd Wright. So I'm not really a sort of scholar of Frank Lloyd Wright. I've not written a PhD on his work or spent hours in his archives mulling over the tens of thousands of millions of documents about Frank Lloyd Wright, even if I am becoming a Smith House expert. Instead, I'm relying on a rich and varied source of literature, both published in Wright's own age and by Wright himself, but also the literal thousands of books written about Frank Lloyd Wright since his career began. It's really an overwhelming avalanche of material that one can procure from the interlibrary loan system about Frank Lloyd Wright. And this sort of insanely overwhelming body of work is going to be reflected in the variety of tracks that we'll trace as we weave through the story of Frank Lloyd Wright's career and legacy. At the end of the course, I'll provide you with an annotated bibliography of the books and websites that I found most useful, and I'll try to credit each source in the lectures as well. I thank in advance all the many photographers and archival sources whose images I rely on to teach about this remarkable architect. So, I do love Frank Lloyd Wright's architecture, but in order to be a good instructor, we have to put on our critical lens. We have to think about Frank Lloyd Wright and his claim that he's the most famous architect in the world. I think it's a claim that is still substantiated, which is kind of amazing for someone who was born in 1867 in rural Wisconsin and who dies in 1959 in Scottsdale, Arizona. I think that there are other architects who could rival Frank Lloyd Wright's fame, maybe Frank Gehry or Norman Foster in Britain. Michelangelo or Da Vinci might come close. Thomas Jefferson is probably the most well-known person who was also an architect. But when you just ask who's an architect, most people will say Frank Lloyd Wright. His archives are impressive. They're now split between the Museum of Modern Art and Columbia University's Avery Fisher Architectural Library. They contain some 55,000 drawings, 125,000 photographs, 285 films, 300,000 sheets of correspondence, and 2,700 manuscripts. And that number increases every year as they continue to acquire and sort the material. He's a singular character with an extraordinarily long career, 1887 to 1959. His influence is huge, but so is his biography. In this lecture series, we'll be examining Wright roughly chronologically and by building type. But in order to understand the story of his architecture, which is what I usually try and focus on, you have to understand the story of the man. Because like so many American greats, self-proclaimed or socially made, of the 20th century, Frank Lloyd Wright is a persona, and he intertwined his own biography with his own architecture. To him, architecture was a spiritual practice embedded in a transcendentalist idea of nature, where you don't just praise trees and water and natural forms, animals, and the sunlight as part of this sort of beautiful, natural, raw existence, but instead as part of the vast cosmos of a greater God, of which humanity and its impact on that nature are also part of the cosmos. So Frank Lloyd Wright really views himself and his buildings as one and the same. And himself is a complicated character with a difficult legacy, especially looking back on some of his ethical and moral failings. So we have 5 weeks to talk about Wright, and I want to dig a little deeper than the biography that you may already know. Just briefly, many people who are generally associated with Frank Lloyd Wright know that he's born in rural Wisconsin, that he trained not at a school, but under the great Chicago architect Louis Sullivan. He developed his signature naturalistic or organic style, the prairie style, in greater Chicagoland out of his Oak Park studio. Then, through personal scandal and tragedy, he abandons his wife and children. His lover and second family are murdered. His home is burned, and burned again. And finally, at the sort of 1930s Great Depression, he opens an architectural school and relaunches his career. And through all of this, he is creating not only a series of sort of knock your socks off modern buildings that live with us in the sort of imagination of American design, but he's also defining himself. There are so many questions that we have to ask of Mr. Frank Lloyd Wright. And over the next 5 weeks, we're going to move through 5 sets of buildings that take us from the late 19th century, really the long 19th century, all the way up to the 1950s, 60s, and today. We'll begin today with an examination of the prairie style, what historians call the first golden era. These are the buildings with low-slung roofs, decorative windows, heavy masonry slabs, houses for generally wealthy clients in idealistic suburban sites. They help to define the modern house, and tonight's lecture is really going to be focusing on the residential aspects of Frank Lloyd Wright's early career. It's easy for an architect to get pigeonholed within a certain field of architecture, and for Wright, that field was residential architecture. Moving on, in week 2, we will be discussing this period of great sort of searching in Wright's career, where through personal scandal and his own phrasing, a sort of tiredness of the prairie style, he seeks a new architectural form language. I am not sure if that marking is on my screen or the projector, but it's not appearing in the Zoom. On the screen we're getting here. Are we being Zoom bombed? That would be a first. We actually might be. If Emma is around, can she investigate that? Meanwhile, I have too much to say about Frank Lloyd Wright. So the second week, we will be examining the legacy of these important structures of the 1920s, when he only builds about 5 buildings, but he begins proposing grand plans. He also begins thinking about his own legacy and his own autobiography, which could easily be classified as a work of fiction. Next, we come to week 3, where we'll talk about the institutions that Wright built, the sort of commercial, civic, cultural, and educational and religious buildings, sort of most defined by the Guggenheim at the end of his career. These buildings were institutions by Wright at the same time he was turning himself into an institution. And we'll talk about the ways in which he was really this unmatched self-promoter on the same level as people like Henry Ford, Charlie Chaplin, Charles Lindbergh, or Walt Disney. Then we'll talk about Frank Lloyd Wright as he is defining himself, but also as he's thinking about much smaller issues than institutions. Things like small houses. Here, the Frank Lloyd Wright designed Smith House for Melvin and Sarah Maxwell Smith. This was part of a series of homes for middle class and sort of young clients without a lot of means, cheap houses to be built on any type of lot. And they were part of Wright's vision for the American suburb, his Jeffersonian ideal inspired by Jefferson, Emerson, Thoreau, William Morris, that we could live in a sort of agrarian America where the city becomes eliminated and we are distributed across the sort of developed prairie landscape. In our last week, we will not be analyzing necessarily building types, but instead looking at how Frank Lloyd Wright survives, how he is still the most famous architect. What is it about his architecture, his personality, or his design legacy that has kept him in the mainstream? And what is the culture around Frank Lloyd Wright? No other architect has so many house museums that are open in his name, and Fallingwater stands as America's most attended site, not for who lived there, but for who designed it. It's essentially the only greatly visited architectural work that's not the house of a US president. And so we'll think about Frank Lloyd Wright as, at the top left, an educator, at the top right, as a salesman, here for House Beautiful and Schumacher Fabrics, or on the lower right, as a popular celebrity on the game show What's My Line, in the center, the cover of Time magazine, or in the lower left, his speeches, which in Rio de Janeiro led to riots in the street and his own arrest, here in London led to students hanging out of windows in Bedford Square to try and get a glimpse of Frank Lloyd Wright entering the Architectural Association. He's a pretty impressive character with some wild stories associated. But all I've said, and I've claimed that I already am biased, I think he's a genius, how are the sort of contradictions in his career going to be dealt with? And the biggest contradiction that I can think of is the fact that the world's greatest architect is famous for buildings that leak. It's kind of one of the most basic principles of architecture to build a structure that will protect you from the weather. And so the fact that he's associated not just famously with leaky buildings, and every tour you go on, even ours, we have stories of water damage and dramatic leaks. Most famously when S.C. Johnson, the head of the S.C. Johnson Wax Company, was sitting down for dinner, a storm rolls in and he's getting drops of water in the middle of the dinner party on his bald head. He calls Frank Lloyd Wright and says, "How are you going to fix this?" And Frank Lloyd Wright suggests moving his chair. In other places, like the Beth Shalom Synagogue, the very dedication of the building, which was after Wright's death, was canceled because of the torrents of rain that came pouring into the building. Critics of Frank Lloyd Wright would say, hey, he's not an architectural genius. He is, basically violating sound building practices. Supporters would say that every building leaks eventually, and that Frank Lloyd Wright's an experimenter, that he's pushing the boundaries, so of course his buildings are going to leak in time. You always have to work with the roof. But as critics, it's a perennial opportunity to pick on Frank Lloyd Wright, and for his sort of supporters, it's a perennial difficulty to have to defend. But if we take the leaks seriously, they are, after all, a perfect symbol for many of the other paradoxes in the way in which Wright took obvious and mischievous delight in his architecture. Let's acknowledge that he was unquestionably brilliant, but let's also acknowledge that there are flaws to his practice. And so as we go about this series, we'll think about the fact that these are beautiful buildings, often beloved buildings, sometimes loathed buildings, and buildings that, in all of their sort of perfection as works of art, do leak. As one homeowner said when asked, does she mind all the leaks in her house, she said, no, it's simply what happens when you put a work of art out in the rain. Now, before I head to the next section, I want to just deal with this issue on the screen. So, so it is not on this screen. It's gone here, but it's also gone to all of our happy people on Zoom. So hopefully Emma has blocked, or Laura, we've blocked people's ability to interact with me I don't think it was me drawing on it. Okay. Now, Frank Lloyd Wright, about 1910, the age of 43, a confident man, a famous man, a well-known architect about to be embroiled in probably the biggest scandal of his life. Wright, more than any other architect, would represent the 20th century in modern architecture, and yet he is very much a child of the 19th century. His aesthetic vision, his moral philosophy, the backbone of his architecture are rooted in ideas that come from the romanticism of the 19th century. When Philip Johnson called Frank Lloyd Wright America's greatest 19th century architect, an insult as he introduced Wright at the Museum of Modern Art, Johnson wasn't entirely wrong. Frank Lloyd Wright stood up and said, "I'm not the greatest 19th century American architect, I'm the greatest architect of any place, of any time." But in 1932, Wright hadn't built a building of significance in over a decade, and there really was this thought that Wright's best works were behind him, that the works of the Chicago Oak Park years were the best that could come from this now sort of middle-aged man. His longevity and his ability to reinvent his architectural forms didn't change, though, his 19th century moral compass. And I think that explains quite a bit of the eccentricities, the eclecticism, and the singularity of Wright's 20th century architecture, is that he's building in a transcendentalist mode that was by then far outdated. It is, I think, the role of genius to take the sort of spirit of their own age, in Wright's case, his childhood in the Welsh clan of his family in Wisconsin, and to adapt that age for a new future. The fact that he's able to take the tenets of Emerson and Whitman and bring them into architecture and then bring them into the late 20th century is more a reflection of his strong personal vision and character, his own ego and centric, sort of genius-centric belief in himself, than it is this sort of necessary reflection of those ideas becoming dated. Even if other people were no longer reading Emerson around the family fireplace, Frank Lloyd Wright was. His accomplishments by 1910, when this portrait was made, were considerable. He had established a distinct architectural style, the prairie style. He had made a fortune in dealing with Japanese prints. He had been schooled not by an architectural program, but by Louis Sullivan. And he was about to set out on a major European tour. But this part of his career, sort of 1887 to 1910, is not as well understood as his later works. I want to start even earlier than his practice, though, looking at his family. His grandfather, Richard Lloyd Jones, who is seen here at center next to an empty chair representing his then-deceased wife, Frank's grandmother, immigrated from Wales to Wisconsin in 1845, escaping religious persecution as an eccentric, political, outspoken Unitarian in a country where Unitarianism was quite unpopular. He was born a Jones, but he married up, and he took his wife's name to create Richard Lloyd Jones. With 7 children, they moved. One child died in the passage, and they had 4 more children born in America. Frank Lloyd Wright's grandfather was a haberdasher, a hat maker by trade. He was a preacher by vocation. He also was a great lover of music, all characteristics instilled in his grandson. Wright learned from the Lloyd Joneses and other members of his family how to defend his artistic vision in the language of a sermon. And he learned from Emerson, the family's hero, the sacrament of beauty and of spirit, which for him became the moral compass. As Frank Lloyd Wright wrote in his autobiography, "Ugliness is anything which the incarnation of sin, and sin is death. Ugliness is death." Beauty in nature was quite literally Wright's religion. Wright's mother and father, seen here, Anna Lloyd Jones and William Wright, were married in Wisconsin. William Wright was born in England or Massachusetts, and he grew up in Hartford, Connecticut. Frank Lloyd Wright's father was a Baptist minister who had studied law at Amherst, but then had a pretty eclectic and tumultuous and unsuccessful career as itinerant music instructor, musician, composer, and preacher. He met Anna Lloyd Jones, a teacher in Wisconsin, and together they had 3 children. According to Wright's autobiography, which again, unreliable narrator here, his mother declared that she was expecting her first child. She knew he would grow up to be an architect and plastered the nursery with pictures of European cathedrals. Wright would do the same thing with his own children, including in the birth announcements where he would write, Frank Lloyd Wright Jr., a sculptor, was born to Frank and Catherine Wright. Wright grew up, though, in an unstable household with a constant lack of resources, with unrelieved poverty, and with anxiety. He traveled around this unhappy childhood, growing up in Iowa, Rhode Island, and finally Weymouth, Massachusetts. It was in Massachusetts where the family traveled down by train to Philadelphia for the 1876 Philadelphia Exposition. It made people love machines, colonial architecture, Japanese architecture, and particularly for Anna Lloyd Wright, the discovery of Froebel blocks would change the course of young Frank Lloyd Wright's life. Wright was then going on 8 or 9, and the system of the program was intended for much younger children. But when Anna found these blocks, which you can see on the left, the gifts instructions, on the right, the maple block gifts, she began to think this was the only true way to educate her children. Froebel, who was a Prussian philosopher-thinker, had developed the system in the 1820s, perfected it in the 30s, and began distributing it in America through kindergartens around this time. Anna bought the blocks in Philadelphia, learned more about kindergarten in Boston, and began instructing the 9-year-old Frank Lloyd Wright in its systems. Now, the Froebel system is another part of the 19th century's obsession with Romanticism. And the Froebel gifts are really this sort of beautiful way of abstracting the natural world, of using pure Euclidean geometries, first in a 2-dimensional form on the tabletop, then in 3-dimensional blocks, to create replicas and a new understanding of the complex world around us. You can see a direct tie from the Froebel blocks of Wright's late childhood to his architecture, and particularly his ornament, the way that this system of abstract geometric thinking would define his architecture. For Frank Lloyd Wright, he said, "I never lost the touch of the Froebel blocks." And for him, they transformed his sense of form into feeling. The family moved back to Wisconsin in 1877, settling in Madison, where Frank Lloyd Wright would study in a much more conventional school, but in his summers spend time on the family's property near Spring Green, Wisconsin. Here's a later photo of the valley by Frank Lloyd Wright, and he tells a story of his uncle picking him up in a horse-drawn carriage and then going on a walk through the snowy wood. And he said he looked back across the snow and he saw his uncle had walked in a straight line, seen here as the dark line that crosses the screen, and that he, the young child, had instead walked in a zigzag line. Also in his biography, he says he's younger because he wanted to be earlier than his contemporaries, so he spent his whole life saying he was born in 1869. He was born in 1867. So anyways, he's saying he's this young child and he's wandering back and forth, and he abstracts this into a geometric design representing his uncle's search for truth through the straight and narrow, and his own through an exploration and sense of discovery. He would use this graphic on the cover of his autobiography in its first edition in 1932. In 1881, soon after Wright turned 14, his parents separated, and in 1885, his father left Wisconsin and was never seen again. His mother then took a rather overbearing role in Wright's childhood and concern with his career as an architect. She would maintain that overbearing role well into her 80s when she traveled alone to Japan with news that Frank Lloyd Wright had gotten ill working on the Imperial Hotel. So she was a strong woman who shaped her son's life, and she sent him to the University of Wisconsin-Madison as a special student. He was enrolled half in the engineering department and half as an employee for the head of engineering, Alan Conover. Now, for Professor Conover, Frank Lloyd Wright learned practical skills, including climbing up the construction site of Science Hall in midwinter to rivet things in the top of the steel structure. He also learned how to draft and do mechanical instruction, but he only spent a few months at the university and left for Chicago in the spring of 1887. It was a calculated risk and a pretty classic move of the American genius, the 19th century character inventing themselves, to sort of throw it all away with a few dollars in the pocket and head to the city. Frank Lloyd Wright arrived at the Chicago and Northeastern Wells Street station, and he was romantically overwhelmed by the sights, sounds, and rain of the city. He didn't know what to do, but he was in a city that at this moment, rebuilding from the Great Fire of 71, believed in this sort of fresh start, this unclouded vision that hard work could not fail to bring about the utopia which the inventions and machines of the 19th century promised. He was met by people like Jane Addams, a family friend, and his uncle, Jenkins Lloyd Jones, who was a major Unitarian figure, political and progressive in the city. It was his uncle who helped introduce him to the architect Joseph Lyman Silsbee. Silsbee had studied at Harvard and MIT and was the sort of Eastern-bred, proper architect who brought the shingle style, or the Queen Anne style, to Chicago. He was described as gentle and well-bred. And so it was Silsbee who instilled in Frank Lloyd Wright a love of drawing, a love of reading about architecture, and also introduced Frank Lloyd Wright to the sort of proper mechanics of how one builds a building and runs an architectural firm. Now, Silsbee himself had been influenced by the English arts and crafts movement, which is a major influence on Wright's life, and of course, the major influence in the creation of Cranbrook. Silsbee had studied under and admired the buildings of people like Richard Norman Shaw in England, who adapted Tudor forms for the 19th century, but was especially enamored with America's first great genius architect, H.H. Richardson of Boston, and houses like his rambling William Watts Sherman House, the sort of definitive format of the American Queen Anne style that Vincent Scully would much later call the shingle style. It is a sort of smoothed over skeleton of sticks wrapped in shingles and windows, this picturesque massing of forms. Other Richardson buildings, like the Slotin House, were even more kind of sheathed in these skins of shingles. And this is the architecture that Frank Lloyd Wright isn't seeing in Chicago necessarily, but which he's reading about in periodicals and books. These are the important buildings of the period in which he is starting his study and practice. And particularly obsessed were architects with the William Lowe House by McKim and White, where here the roof has become the entire architecture and all of the rooms are subsumed within this great shingle shell. But the plan of these shingle houses is not particularly revolutionary. You see here a central hall, which you enter, and then a sort of parlor and dining room, and then small cells for servants and larger cells for the family. All of it very conventional and sort of a direct line from American colonial architecture all the way through this late 19th century. This begins to change with Richardson, who in some of his later shingle-style houses will begin to disintegrate the box. Now, where we're going with this is a full elimination of the cellular room by Frank Lloyd Wright. So remember that this is probably the most kind of avant-garde floor plan that American architects would have seen in 1886, where the house itself is this picturesque mass, but the interior has begun opening up, and walls are beginning to be transitioned into curtains, into screens, and rooms are beginning to link together not through doorways that close, but through portals that frame space and lead from one area to the next. Wright would have undoubtedly been familiar with the Glessner House in Chicago, built for one of the wealthiest merchants in town. It's Richardson's greatest work in the Midwest, his signature ashlar limestone facade, this sort of flat building devoid of ornament, and then the house tightly packed on this urban lot. But what's not happening here is any sort of progressive floor plan. It's essentially a townhouse floor plan that would have been familiar in cities around the world, tightly arranged on the box and moving towards something new. And the flatness of the whole thing is really what probably struck Wright the most. So Silsbee is working with these influences, Wright is reading these influences, and together they're working on a church for Wright's uncle. It was to be an expression of Jenkins Lloyd Jones's philosophies. It was to be freedom from sort of any connotations of religious architecture. It has this sort of eccentricity and studied informality. It looks more like a suburban house than a church. It's very asymmetric and very picturesque. Now, Silsbee also gets a commission from the Lloyd Joneses to design a church back in Wisconsin, which again looks very typical of the shingle style. Frank Lloyd Wright's first published design is this church from 1887, the start of his long career. It was a church he designed for the magazine American Inland Architect, and it very much reflects the prevailing trends of the Richardsonian Romanesque with the heavy stones and his mentor Silsbee's shingle style with this one great roof sort of dominating the entire arrangement and the windows all squished down below, but then picturesque elements that aren't entirely necessary like the cone and the little window, these elements that make it charming, a sort of architectural pursuit popular in the 19th century. It was Wright's next designs that actually get built, a school for his two aunts in Wisconsin. He adapts a design that he had again done for Inland Architect into a school for this progressive reform community. But he's also getting tired of Silsbee and the Queen Anne style. He is learning the sort of limits of the Queen Anne, or later the shingle style, this sort of idea of continuous windows wrapping the building in bays and at corners, this central stair hall plan radiating out, the veranda that wraps the building, all bound by a sort of monolithic material like shingles are stone. And he thinks, what's next? And he knows he'll need to leave for a new firm to learn more than what Silsbee can provide. The biggest lesson that Silsbee gave Wright, though, was access to his architectural library. And Frank Lloyd Wright begins to read books that were not in the family library. He had sort of studied at the highest level Emerson, Thoreau, all the sort of great transcendentalists, the Bible. And then at sort of the lower end at the University of Wisconsin, he had studied drafting and mechanical illustration. But what he was missing was architecture. And he begins to read three important books: Owen Jones's The Grammar of Ornament, Violet Deluxe Dictionary, and then John Ruskin, In All Forms. And these three become the pillar of his application, his portfolio to work for Louis Sullivan. And here's the drawing that led that portfolio of over 100 tracings of Owen Jones's Grammar of Ornament. Sullivan interviews Wright. Sullivan is at the height of his career in Chicago. He's certainly the most famous architect working in the city. He's partnered with the German engineer Dankar Adler. And together, Sullivan and Adler need a new assistant to help delineate the auditorium building, what will be their most celebrated project in Chicago. And so Frank Lloyd Wright comes to learn from whom he calls the Liebermaster for the rest of his career. And he works on the interior of the auditorium as a draftsman. But he quite quickly becomes a trusted right-hand associate of Louis Sullivan. They're only 13 years apart in age. And when the building is finished, the firm moves into offices here at the top tower. And Frank Lloyd Wright is given an office directly next to Sullivan of the same size. And he's made a partner, a junior partner in the office practice. It's a pretty remarkable rise in just a few years for a rather uneducated architect. Now, Sullivan is famous for inventing the skyscraper and his tall buildings. Probably the most iconic is the Wainwright in St. Louis, where you see here the structural steel skeleton fireproofed through brick and terracotta. What I love about Sullivan and what he is kind of most endearing for are these rich botanic, organic, ornamental forms, the way that he uses pure geometry and naturalistic leaves and foliage to make the building come alive. This was Sullivan's genius, the ability to partner with an engineer and then create these organic shapes. What he was less interested in were houses, and so he turns the design of houses for the firm over to Frank Lloyd Wright. And historians debate back and forth how much of a house by Sullivan and Adler and Sullivan is a Frank Lloyd Wright house. Some say every house they designed with Wright employment was a Wright house. Some say they're all Sullivan houses, which Wright drew. It goes back and forth, but needless to say, this was Wright's specialty in the firm. You can see here he signed the drawing in the lower right-hand corner. The house that brings them the most fame, in which Frank Lloyd Wright did claim and was supported in this claim that he designed entirely, was what Frank Lloyd Wright also said, rather self-affirmingly, is the first modern building. In reality, it's the first great modern monument of Wright's career. Still today, the Charnley House, which is now the home of the Society of Architectural Historians in Chicago, is quite a compelling but also challenging building. It sits among an eclectic neighborhood of mid-century modern high-rises and Victorian kind of piles, pomp and circumstance, and it's made entirely of flat orange Roman brick and cream crisp limestone. Notice what's missing from the building. There are no windowsills. There is no sort of string course. There's no delineation of the floor plates at the mid-level. There's really nothing asymmetrical about the form. The only projection is this balcony off the stair hall on the second floor. It is a solid and closed building, this sort of house as fortress, this house as Froebel block. You can see directly where Wright is taking the abstraction of the block into architecture. And in the floor plan, we don't see too much advancement. This wing here is a later addition. So what's originally there, you essentially walk in a stair hall. You have a hearth and stair here, a parlor, and a dining room. And then above that, you have bedrooms. Below that, you have kitchens. But what the floor plan is not particularly innovative for the period. The interior is. Wright has smoothed away Sullivan's luscious ornament. He has contained it to moments of intersection where railings meet the hand, where the newel post pops up, where the actual hearth exists. He's eliminated things like a mantle entirely. He's also eliminated the more popular coal stove in favor of a wood-burning fireplace, which seems so intrinsic to a fireplace now, but at the time had not been used since Ben Franklin invented the Franklin stove. He goes back to this more primal sense of fire in the home. He goes back to a cleaner sense of architectural ornament, and it's a masonry structure, so you have these thick walls, and they seem to be flattened out as sort of wooden singular wooden surfaces, almost postmodern in reading. It really is the start of modern domestic architecture in Chicago. And Frank Lloyd Wright says there is no possible source that he has ever seen. This came out of his mind as he sat at home after work. But of course, Frank Lloyd Wright would say that about everything, and without too much difficulty, in looking at the same books that Frank Lloyd Wright looks at, you do see that he is coming from tradition, that he is coming from a past. Architecture doesn't exist in a vacuum. It didn't then, it doesn't now. And architects must look and study their history in order to learn about the future. Frank Lloyd Wright was doing it, he just couldn't admit it. To him, it would undercut his genius. It doesn't. It's how the architect, the creative artist, works. They search for new form while examining past forms. And you can see here he has taken the great French Lido in this 18th century building and he has updated it for a modern urban site. Now, Sullivan and Wright were both sort of poets in a certain sense. And as their relationship bloomed and these houses are being built, they become closer partners. Wright becomes frustrated by his position under Sullivan. And he says later in life that though Sullivan was his greatest master and the greatest architect besides himself to ever live, that Sullivan's greater lessons were the poetry, were the way that Sullivan educated Wright with words and with sort of ornament. Here, the foliated details of the Carson Peary Scott building in Chicago. Sullivan wrote lines like, "The artist is an orange tree, bearing continually flowers and ripeness at every stage, pendant golden thoughts, fruits of all that sap we call imagination." He wrote that in 1889, and I think that's the kind of poetic romanticism that so appealed to Wright about Sullivan the thinker and Sullivan the architecture. Wright would credit Sullivan as influencing him through conversation as much as design. The last great hurrah of the two men and really one of Sullivan's last great works, was the transportation building for the 1893 World's Fair, where Wright is at the peak of his influence under Sullivan. Sullivan is at his peak of influence in Chicago, and they basically decorate a giant shed that Adler had designed to hold trains and horseless carriages with this rich kind of vaguely Asian, vaguely Middle Eastern, vaguely classical facade, the Golden Gate, where ornament by Sullivan and a layering of space, a turning of stairways into the building by Wright, combine into this rather magnificent portal. But that was really not what the fair was known for. It was known for Daniel Burnham's neoclassical great court, which, according to both Sullivan and Wright, set American architecture back 50 years. It was this court that would give us Washington, D.C. as we know it. The great senator from Michigan, McMillan, visited the court and then started his McMillan Commission, which in 1902 would see McKim, and White redesigning the Washington Mall and establishing neoclassical architecture as the federal style. These are not federal buildings, though. These are made of paper and stucco and paper mache. They are made of essentially popsicle sticks and tinfoil. And Frank Lloyd Wright saw this as a horror. He saw the classicism as a horror. He saw the importation of European ideas a horror, European ideas from the Renaissance, not even modern Europe, as really just having no place, especially in the center of the American continent. This was an architecture wholly removed from American democracy, from the American landscape, from what he viewed as American architecture. But what it did show Frank Lloyd Wright was that architecture can exist as a temporary image. And this idea of the folly is, I think, one of the reasons why I'm not too bothered by the leaks of a Frank Lloyd Wright building. He designed over 2,000 buildings and designs in his lifetime, of which 700 or something are built, of which many have been destroyed. And he said he was never bothered when a building of his was knocked down. I think of what he must have felt standing in the Great Court, looking at this neoclassical facade that would all fall apart in the rain over the course of the fair. And he realizes that architecture is an image, that it can exist as a permanent structure, but it can also exist as a photograph, as a drawing, as an idea, as a way of conveying your ideas, your values, and your meaning into the future outside of itself as a structure. Beyond this idea of architecture as a folly, as a sort of impermanent art, considered quite permanent by most, he was also influenced by the Japanese pavilion, which was built by Japanese craftsmen and featured the design of a 15th century Japanese temple built on an artificial lagoon in Jackson Park and filled with Japanese objects. It ignited in Wright a love of Japanese architecture, of its design, and particularly Japanese prints, which would become the main source of income for Frank Lloyd Wright in his early career, the dealing in of Japanese prints. But what Frank Lloyd Wright and many other Chicago school architects especially noted about this pavilion is that it is only really made up of a solid ground, a solid base, and then a solid roof, which overhangs an entirely temporary structure. Only one wall of the temple is solid, the back wall, against prevailing winds. The rest are made of paper and cloth, and they are on sliding screens. And so hour by hour, purpose by purpose, the entire building can transform within its roof and ground plane. And that will transform Frank Lloyd Wright's idea of architectural space and the home. 1893 is also the time where Wright is starting his family. He had married in 1889 Catherine Tobin. They had 6 children quickly thereafter, and he had also signed a contract in 1889 with Louis Sullivan for a 5-year employment. He got advances on that employment. You can see the happy family here on the steps of their new Frank Lloyd Wright designed home. We have Catherine and their firstborn, I think. We have Anna, his mother, and Frank Lloyd Wright here, other members of the mighty Lloyd Joneses around them, sitting on the porch of the Frank Lloyd Wright house in Oak Park. They had moved to Oak Park following a Unitarian minister, a woman who Anna Lloyd Wright knew, and brought them to Oak Park. It was a leafy but boring suburb known for its religious fervor. And Frank Lloyd Wright built what he said was an entirely genius, entirely new house. This great sort of Froebel triangle on top of a circular patio with a floor plate squished in between. You can see how much he responded to Japanese architecture just in books. This is before he's seen the World's Fair as he's designing his house. But I'm not sure it's Japan so much as the shingle style that's still influencing Frank Lloyd Wright. Projects like Bruce Price's fairly well published and well known to Wright house, where he too takes a giant triangle over a rusticated base. But what Price does that Wright won't is add sort of traditional ornament and all those sort of flourishes of the shingle style. Wright has simplified his shingle style home to just shingles. And on the plan, Frank Lloyd Wright is beginning to think of the house as a pretty efficient unit of non-connected spaces or non-traditionally connected spaces. In its decor, he is following his mother's lead that there should be nothing useless in the home. She was a minimalist in all of their residences as they traveled, partly because they were poor, partly because she thought weeds were the best decoration. And Wright begins to decorate his own home with weeds gathered by his wife and mother. The house is centered on an inglenook, which becomes a sort of favored form of the arts and crafts architects in England, comes over to America, and is in the hand of Frank Lloyd Wright, a powerful sort of seating element next to the hearth. In the Japanese temple, it's a sort of ceremonial personal shrine at the heart of the home. In the American Frank Lloyd Wright house, the heart of the home is the fireplace, the hearth. In his dining room, he invents his first furniture designs, high-back chairs that are meant to enclose you within a larger room, a more intimate gathering. And you also begin to see his geometric designs departing from Sullivan. Instead of sort of foliated decoration, the ceiling is made up of a jigsaw cut screen of flat geometries. And he's always interested in machine production. The reason the chairs are flat, the reason the moldings are flat, is because he's most interested in machine-milled lumber. He is not sort of arts and crafts to the handmade, he is arts and crafts plus the machine, the title of his greatest speech in the 1890s. And here we see Frank Lloyd Wright lounging in his success on the porch of his home. But his success was still under Sullivan, and he starts to moonlight. This will cause the dissolution of their partnership as Frank Lloyd Wright builds houses for his friend Walter Gale, which lead to bootlegged houses for other clients. Sullivan is not getting a cut of these commissions. Frank Lloyd Wright is doing them under the table and under a friend's name. Frank Lloyd Wright designs mostly sort of little Queen Anne houses that start to show some of his tendencies, but also very strange houses like the George Blossom House, Frank Lloyd Wright's only contribution to the increasingly popular colonial revival style. He also designs the Bagley House in the Dutch colonial style, which is most interesting to me for this rather sort of shingle-style detail of almost a windmill on the side, an octagonal form attached to the house, which is a library enclosed on 7 sides by books and illuminated by a clear story up above, the precursor to many forms that Wright would later use in his practice. Most odd from this period is Frank Lloyd Wright's only known Beaux-Arts design, a competition entry for a Milwaukee Public Library and Museum, where for someone who hated the Beaux-Arts movement and French neoclassicism so much, you question why, when the competition specified that this had to be the style, Wright even entered it. He does begin to enter other competitions. We'll talk about some of those designs in later lectures, and wins them with more sort of shingle-style designs. This will remain an outlier. In 1893, he also is fired by Louis Sullivan, who finds out about these projects done out from underneath the firm. They get into a fight, they throw either a T-square or a triangle, blood is drawn, and they don't talk to each other for almost 20 years. Wright will continue to refer to Sullivan as his master, and in the 1920s they do make up. But it is a tough break of two talented architects. In 1895, Wright is hired by the American Luxfer Prism Company to design glass tiles, and he uses the money from that contract to build a playroom on which he would perform plays for his children and interact with his 6 kids in the Froebel system that they were learning with under this great domed space, all leading towards a mural depicting Arabian Nights. On the back side of the room was originally a copy of Winged Victory from the Louvre, Wright's favorite sculptor, as well as an eclectic glass lampshade that Wright designed with the American Luxfer Prism Company. This addition to his home was quickly followed by the studio, where Wright would design for the next years until 1910. He always maintained an office in Chicago, but the home and studio here was really his base of design. The Chicago office kept him in societal conventions as an American architect, going into town, going to the office, but the home office put him into the peers of continental architects like Eliel Saarinen, who worked alongside their family. His whole practice ate lunch in the dining room. Catherine made the lunch, or Anna made the lunch, and then they returned to work, and then in the evenings they would perform music and discuss poetry and literature. It was the classic kind of art-life-work balance of the arts and crafts that doesn't really appear in American homes, but Frank Lloyd Wright started in Oak Park. The building is subdivided on one end by his library and office, entered through the center in a vestibule, and then the studio on the left. You enter it not straight through the front door, but up a side stairway, into a portico, through a side door, and into the vestibule here. And then you can see we can either walk straight down this hallway under a beautiful art glass illuminated screen, and into the library, or behind us into the studio, centered again on the hearth. It was in this studio that his most important early prairie works come out. First, the William Winslow House, which emerges right straight onto the scene to the praise of people like Daniel Burnham, who say, "Here, a home for any fine American gentleman." It's a house that is symmetrical, that is unusual, that is once familiar and comforting, at the same time quite challenging in its sources of inspiration. What is Wright doing here? It looks like a house, but it doesn't look like a house. He's used his favored orange Roman brick, Indiana limestone, but now added to it a course of dark plaster that's richly textured under a huge overhanging roof shelter. It mirrors the pavilion, the Japanese pavilion, and it also leads into a plan that is beginning to get more complicated. You are adding in bathrooms and kitchens and machines, implements that necessarily deviate the floor plan from that kind of classic American box with parlor on one side, hall in the middle, dining room on the other. You're beginning to get Wright pushing the floor plan out in directions. What this causes on the front is no change, but what it causes on the back is this kind of weird, non-related facade of a turret and a portico and this kind of odd outcropping. While things like this want us to think Wright's linear career is just going to go straight to the Roby house, it doesn't. He needs work. And so when clients like Nathan Moore come and say, "I want an English house and only an English house," and Wright says, "You want a modern house and only a modern house," and Moore says, "I'll go to another architect, but you're my next door neighbor," Wright gives him an English house, his one entry into the sort of half-timbered Tudor-Beathan style so popular in this eclectic era. He also does this kind of French mansard, but in his own way, where the second floor is entirely roof, instead of his preferred low-hipped roof, now a very steep roofed, but still with a division of then plaster and brick and stone. Now, some of his early projects will be getting us towards his golden age of the prairie style, like this house on the Michigan waterfront where he can't plant trees because of the sandy soil, and so he invents his famous Wrightian urn. I include this house simply because who doesn't love those urns? And this is the first inclusion of them in one of his projects. But the project that launches his national fame and which introduces the term prairie to his architectural style is a home in Prairie Town. Ladies' Home Journal wanted to commission architects to improve the general mood of American domestic architecture, particularly at the middle class. They wanted architects to design ideal houses and then to sell the blueprints for just $5 for working drawings. Frank Lloyd Wright was paid handsomely, and Ladies' Home Journal would take the rest. They sold one copy. But what it does do is it clarifies and crystallizes Frank Lloyd Wright's principles of what will become prairie architecture. He simply would have called it modern or up-to-date architecture before this. The prairie style, as seen here in a house in Prairie Town, it's a low-slung building under overreaching eaves, no basement, no attic. It has open windows in ribbons instead of in punctured blocks. It's a monolithic material, here seen in plaster. That plaster would continue on the inside. The house is tied to its landscape through both landscape planning and also its orientation to its neighbors. It is all of the features of the golden age of the prairie house. It was followed quickly by a house for, I love the title, A Small House with Lots of Room in It, which has a sort of variation on the gable end. And this house really would become the prototype for the first true prairie houses of Wright's career. These are also, incidentally, the first Frank Lloyd Wright houses I ever visited in 5th grade. The two Kankakee, Illinois houses for a brother and sister and their spouses, which begin to show the flowing plan, the directional lines, the low-hanging roofs that greatly overhang the houses, and the reduced floor heights, the reduction of window sills, and the ribbons of casement windows featuring geometric ornament. The most advanced of his planning comes in 1903 with the Willits House, when he begins to think of the architecture as a pinwheel, and he begins to eliminate rooms as cells at all, and instead features intersecting wings. You can think of these as almost like trays that are floating in space. There's no differentiation on the ceiling, on the floor, on the wall. Instead, you have the fireplace, the hearth, you have wooden screens and stairways, and then an open flow of space. Houses like these had clients that sometimes could afford Wright to decorate them, sometimes couldn't. One of the great failures of the Chicago school was that these are hard to decorate if you don't have the architect do it. But when given the chance, like at the Susan Lawrence Dana house, Frank Lloyd Wright could transform this prairie architectural language into a total work of art, into that German concept of the Gesamtkunstwerk, where the architect controls everything from the architecture to the landscape, the site plan, to the furniture, the rugs, the textiles, the murals, the tables, the plate settings, even the dresses of Mrs. Dana were designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. Susan Lawrence Dana's parents had made a fortune in Springfield. They were social leaders of very modest means, and she wanted to renovate the family's Italianate villa. Eventually, she spent quite a fortune, saved one room, a parlor, as a shrine to her modest mother, and Frank Lloyd Wright rebuilt the entire site in his vision, with these hefty brick pillars supporting orange stone and cast concrete detailing, and then accented by copper eaves and copper patinated plaster sculptural second floor walls. On the inside, it is a sort of great mass of movement with intersecting vistas and structural forms that move slowly over the level ground. Notice how it appears that wooden moldings are sort of floating in space, and they seem to not be bound by what you are on the ground, by rugs and centers of space and stairs. Instead, the structure and the movement through the space have become two dramatic acts in the sort of opera of moving through the house. And it's, of course, Wagner that Frank Lloyd Wright is thinking of as the greatest Gesamtkunstwerk. And here is his sort of Wagnerian house, where everything is designed by Wright and everything is designed to be discovered and seen through sequence and through vistas. He doesn't do it alone. He relies on George Niedecken, a Milwaukee cabinet maker and decorator who did almost all the Oak Park furniture. He fabricated everything, and he also executed the paintings. Wright also had window makers like Orlando Giannini. Here, the window maker was Linden Glass Company, all executed to Wright's design. And the house featured rather spectacular kind of spaces like a gallery where Susan Lawrence Dana indulged in her brand new passion of Japanese prints. Where was she getting those Japanese prints but for the Midwest greatest Japanese print dealer, Frank Lloyd Wright? So he would make 10% of the cost of the building, which almost always was double, triple, or quadruple the cost he quoted you. And then he would also sell you all of the furnishings, furniture, and all of the decoration. And he would simply describe your possessions as the horrors of a past age. He never allowed, quote unquote, dinosaurs into his home. Now, there were more modest prairie houses of this sort of golden period. This house I include because the Thomas house got the name in the neighborhood as the harem, because from the outside you think this house is entirely black. This house has no windows. It looks like a brothel. But what actually Frank Lloyd Wright has done is taken the European concept, the continental concept of the piano nobile, and he has reversed the layout of the house so that the service spaces are on the ground floor, not the basement or in an outbuilding, and the living spaces are on the second floor. He is letting the sort of view of the prairie, the view of the neighborhood become abstracted. He knows now people are going to be driving in cars soon. You're not going to have the slow sort of locomotion of the horse and carriage. Why would you want to be at that level? Raise yourself up and then transform the architecture into ribbon windows with a living room prow here, a dining room prow here, bedrooms up above, playrooms and service spaces in the first floor. And then the detailing, what we love so much about Frank Lloyd Wright and what we can get on socks and cell phone cases and embroidery kits today, the sort of windows and decorations and ornament system of Frank Lloyd Wright. Other architecture of this period include the Hertley House, where he's sort of adapting this very solid Richardsonian character, but turning it into his horizontal prairie language. It has a certain grandeur to it, and also, again, relies on this floating quality of raising the second floor up. Now, what this allows that wasn't present in earlier prairie houses is the ceiling to become the actual roof line of the house. And so you begin to understand on the exterior, the architecture is a giant roof. And on the interior, you are under that giant roof. Now, like any good dome or architect, it's not always an exact line. You have insulation and other practicalities, but it is reading as one system. And I love in this house the way that Frank Lloyd Wright begins to allow an open floor concept on a pretty tight urban site. And so you see here the way that the living spaces flow one to another, even though the house is essentially square. This really is the birth of the open concept home. For Edwin and Mamah Cheney, he designs a small cottage, which is just one story, but he raises that one story on an earthen berm. And for William E. Martin, he designs a very tight house in Chicago on a very narrow urban lot, where the prairie style, which sort of demands space, is squished into a single lot. Now, Martin was the president of the Martin Stove Polish Company in Chicago, and he was quite enamored with his house. He invites his brother, Darwin Martin, to come and see it. Darwin Martin was an active and progressive man and head of the Larkin Soap Company. Larkin was a mail-order catalog, much like Sears, providing home goods, soaps, and grocery staples. And the officers of the company were all related in both business and in life. The co-founders had been John Larkin and Elbert Hubbard, who is the founder of the Roycrofters Colony. When Hubbard left to go and start that great arts and crafts project in East Aurora, Martin was brought in. The Martins and Larkins and Hubbards are all intermarried to various sisters, and they begin to commission a series of 9 projects from Frank Lloyd Wright. First, the Georgian Delta Barton House for Darwin Martin's sister. This is a test case to see if Darwin Martin can work with Frank Lloyd Wright. It's a very simple prairie house. You have a porch and porte cochere on 2 sides. You have living room and dining room in the center, up above the bedrooms. The clarity is chef's kiss. And it leads to a much grander vision and campus. Here you see the Barton House is one corner of a rather magnificent property in the Frederick Law Olmsted designed Jewett Parkway neighborhood. You have the main house here, a 100-foot long conservatory leading to sort of served spaces in the back, a kitchen garden on one side, a pleasure garden on the other. And here we see the house today. I should note that it's mostly a reconstruction. The house was largely demolished, so this is the great victory of architectural preservation in the New York State park system. We see here the house is all eaves, all landscape, all linked together in these great masses of brick and planters and landscape. How do you get into this building between these brick columns? There seem to be no walls and no doors, only structure. Well, we turn to the side and you see the little stairs here, which lead up to the front door, cove-like, as if you're in a Japanese garden, Japanese pavilion, slipping into the building. Once you go inside, this idea of are you inside or are you outside is really toyed with by Wright. You enter into a sort of garden pergola with vines and a Japanese print, of course sold by Wright, and 180-foot long view down to another edition of the Winged Victory. You turn to the left and you have the reception hall with its great Japanese fan-style fireplace, all done in custom Roman brick, and all of the mortar lines of the interior now gilt with little gold leaf pressed into the brickwork. The furniture is a series of circles and squares. The light fixtures are circles and squares. The fireplace is a circle in a square room. Then there are these wonderful barrel chairs by Wright, which become one of his most favorite designs for 30 years, that are an adaptation of chairs he had seen at the 1904 World's Fair from Austrian designers like Joseph Maria Ulbricht, one of his heroes. He uses these designs, he adapts them to his own language, and the reception hall leads to this fireplace, shown here before restoration, now with its restored glass-backed gold-leafed tile system, designed likely by Blanche Osterog and made by Orlando Giannini of Chicago. This fireplace anchors the home in this enormous central room. It shimmers with its wisteria pattern. And on one side is the dining room, which has a table in the shape of an I-beam with chairs shaped with an I-beam back, all of which is underneath a steel-reinforced I-beam in concrete fireproof construction. Notice here in this photograph that all the windows are open. Wright had a custom system for designing sash windows so that they would open clear to the structure of the wall. There essentially is no wall here. All you have is columns, floor, and ceiling. And that becomes especially evident looking back from the dining room to the library, where all the books are hidden behind wooden cases, except over here, where Mr. Darwin's Encyclopedia Britannica is shelved. Darwin had stopped school at the 5th grade, but he loved learning. He wanted the Encyclopedia Britannica out. Wright insisted that the books be horizontal. And then there are these structural piers here, where you look through these 8 pier clusters made of 4 steel-reinforced brick columns each. They hold the mechanical systems of the house. They hold the load of the house. They also hold the heating system. You never see a heating grate. And then the art glass windows screen and shield views throughout the house and sound, much like the Japanese screens of the pavilions Wright so admired. Wisteria becomes the dominant theme of design in the house. Here you see Wright's abstract wisteria windows and wisteria skylights, which reflect a trellis immediately outside, covered in growing wisteria. Nature comes into the house through Wright's dress designs, through the Japanese prints he sold the Martins, and through a collection of features from the gardener. All of it so deeply influenced by Wright's own love of the Japanese print and Japanese modern architecture. Now looking down the great gallery towards the Winged Victory, here she is in her sort of cathedral of a garden conservatory, which Wright demanded be filled with tropical plants. Now, on top of this long linear building are little apartment houses for birds. If you know anything about birds in upper New York, you know that these apartment-style birdhouses are for purple martins. And so you have martin houses on top of the martin house. And then when you have the functional spaces, this sort of clear evidence that we are in the 20th century, a hyper-modern kitchen now restored. For the Martins, he also designed homes for their lawyers. He designed the administration building that we'll talk about in later lectures, one of the great defining moments of Wright's career and the introduction of modern commercial architecture in this country. It was actually not greatly enjoyed by the company. It was over budget and over delayed, and it also was ignored by American architectural press, but this is the building that reignites the passion for Wright in Europe. For the Martins, he also designs the Easy Polish Shoe Factory in Chicago, which is a direct contemporary with Albert Kahn's steel-reinforced factory for Packard. And so, though Frank Lloyd Wright is really not an engineering genius, he is right with the times. He is designing a steel-reinforced factory at the same time Albert Kahn is really perfecting the same form. And quickly thereafter, Wright designs one of America's first great concrete structures. Again, we'll talk about this more in our institutions lecture. All of this to say that this period, this 1900 to 1909 period, Wright is really flourishing. He is at the top of his game, and he is redefining domestic architecture and redefining, in many senses, the future of modern commercial, civic, and institutional architecture. I want to end here with just 3 buildings, the 3 most important projects for Wright's late career, the sort of closing of his golden age. First, the Avery and Queenie Coonley House. Queenie Ferry was of the Detroit-based Ferry Seed Company. She was an heir. Avery Cooney was an heir, and they wanted to spend their money in philanthropic ways for their family, their neighborhood, and greater Chicagoland. They would do that out of the largest prairie house Frank Lloyd Wright ever designed. Here, the main facade of the living room, here seen in color, and then the interior under these great overarching eaves. All the spaces now completely disappearing, significantly less formal than the Martin house. It was a younger family, it was a more progressive couple, and Wright takes his sort of plastic sculptural obsession that was so evident in the shingle-style architecture, and now he brings it back into his architecture, creating plastic interior spaces that seem to push and pull without limits. And next up is the Roby House, my favorite of Wright's prairie houses, the great sort of battleship next to the University of Chicago, built for a University of Chicago alumna and her husband, the 28-year-old manager of the Excelsior Supply Company. They had to sell the house quite quickly after building it. They could not afford it. But they build this house, this ship, this urban Frank Lloyd Wright mansion, where all of the spaces seem to float in great trays, and where there is no garden, there is no lawn, there's essentially no view, Wright now internalizes those views into planters and porches, and he floats the spaces with seemingly no lower supports. How do you get in? Through the back side, and so you slip around the house under the eave, in through a rather crazy circulation pattern, up a stair hall, and into one giant Japanese-esque room where the furniture is executed by Wright's chief assistant, Marion Mahoney, who worked with Wright for 13 years, the only woman licensed architect in Chicago. She took over the firm when Wright departed Chicago in 1909 and finished all the furnishings here in the Roby House. Now, the Roby House is Wright's, he considered it his masterpiece along with the Martin House of this age, and it features all these wonderful effects. But the project that wasn't built that could have changed Wright's course is the McCormick House. The McCormicks were, unlike the Robys and the Coonleys and these other wealthy clients, the McCormicks were high society. They were East Coasters and Chicago people. They were Rockefellers, Mrs. McCormick. And so this would have been the stamp of social approval on the Chicago school. The Chicago school was weird. The press was critical of Wright's buildings, the local press. The architects in Europe loved it. Architects in America, half and half. The population, a little bit ambivalent at best, critical at worst. And so the McCormicks, having executed this design, would have said, prairie architecture is here to stay, prairie architecture is the future. And the fact that Mrs. Rockefeller McCormick quite boldly fires Frank Lloyd Wright in favor of Charles Augustus Platt, one of the great eclectic architects and classicists of the 20th century, to build an Italianate villa, destroys Wright's confidence. It destroys his confidence in the ability to keep the office open. It destroys his confidence in his style. Again, in his autobiography, he talks about this project really ending his love of the prairie style when it's canceled. And in 1909, Wright will make a life-changing decision to leave his wife and children, to leave his practice in the hands of a relatively new draftsman, to leave Marion Mahoney in charge of finishing the dozens of projects on the boards. They were at a rate of 6 weeks. A project would come out of the studio, and Frank Lloyd Wright leaves it all. He sells the office downtown, and he runs away with Mamah Cheney, the wife of the Edwin and Mamah Cheney house. They had started their relationship when the house was under construction. It developed into an intellectual pair. Wright felt Catherine was not his intellectual equal, and Mamah, who was progressive, a feminist, and a sort of intellectual, was. Next week, we'll begin with the repercussions of that scandal, but it does damage not only Wright's reputation, it devastates his family and his wife, it also causes the great desert of projects that are to come in next week's lecture. I look forward to seeing where Frank Lloyd Wright will take us as he begins his period of wandering in the desert and a new stylistic expression for the new decade. Thank you, everyone.